Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For this week's episode, I take you inside a Canadian media company that's grown to 11 separate local news sites. The last decade hasn't been kind to local newspapers. According to one study, 1,800 newspapers have shut down since 2004, and many of those that survived are facing tighter margins, layoffs, and corporate consolidation. There are myriad reasons for this retrenchment. Part of the blame is on hedge funds that buy up local media companies and then squeeze them dry. Others point to major platforms like Facebook, Google, and Craigslist, all of which have siphoned away a large portion of the local advertising newspapers traditionally relied on. Despite these headwinds, we've seen a few digital upstarts thrive in the local news market. One such company is Village Media, which started out as a single news site in an Ontario city and has since grown to 11 sites spread out across Canada. I recently interviewed Jeff Elgie, Village Media's CEO, about the company's history and how it succeeded where so many legacy newspapers have struggled or failed. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about my email newsletter. If you're not subscribed, then you're missing out on some of the most in-depth analysis on the media industry that you'll find anywhere. This week, for instance, I wrote a 1,500-word piece about how difficult it is to charge for subscriptions if you're a solo content creator, and how the 1,000 True Fans theory created by Kevin Kelly a decade ago is flawed. If you're not subscribed, then you should pause this episode right now and go to simonowens.substack.com to sign up. But don't just take my word for it. Here's Jane Friedman, a journalist and consultant in the publishing industry, explaining how she thinks my newsletter delivers value.
I think in my world, if someone is a freelance writer or a journalist who is dealing with issues related to social media, if they're also dealing with how do I make money in the new media environment, I think that subscribing to your newsletter keeps them very aware of what the top of mind issues are and what who the important figures or organizations are. So I think you do also more in-depth interviews and coverage of how this is all unfolding that it's hard to find elsewhere.
Again, if you want to subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Okay, now let's jump to my interview with Village Media's Jeff Elgie. Hey Jeff, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So you run something called Village Media. What does Village Media do?
Village Media is a network of local community-based media sites, primarily headquartered in Ontario, Canada, but we now have partner sites all across the country.
And it's a company that's has a headquarters and then owns all these individual local sites in these different locations.
Yeah, so we own 11 of our own community sites, and then we have another 13 sites that we work with a number of other media partners on.
So it started as like a single site, like over a decade ago, right? Like how did it get its start?
Yeah, it actually, the early beginnings were a coupon site in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, a small community of about 75,000 people. And it's a long story, but basically the coupon site didn't work. And some of the learnings by the early founders were that, they needed content to get people to keep coming back to the site. And, through this long process of over a couple of years, it evolved into something that's now called Sue Today, and now the original community media site in our entire network. And so that's
their idea. So there was these like local people, they decided, we're going to go around to all the different local businesses and get them to offer coupons on our website to local residents, and people are going to go to this site and download these coupons or something like that. And that was kind of the initial idea.
Yeah, exactly. And as you could imagine, just sustaining that in terms of the cost of promoting it, and then the effectiveness of it. In those days, people didn't generally go online and print out coupons and bring them into local retailers. So it as its own kind of standalone concept just didn't work out.
And so how did they build out that? Like, what was kind of that organic growth of that initial newsroom?
So the early days, when they looked at the cost of the model in the coupon world, it was, attracting audience on a regular basis, meaning they were advertising in the paper, on billboards, on radio. And so they thought, well, if we kind of get a well-known local columnist and get them to start contributing a piece, maybe people will start coming back. And that was true. That started to happen. And so, as the business evolved and the name changed, they added really the trigger point, the turning point was the addition of a dedicated full-time local reporter. Um, that things started to really turn around.
And it started with a local columnist. So like he or she wasn't even doing original reporting, was just writing columns about different stuff. They saw some initial traction from that and they decided, let's convert that into like more robust reporting.
You got it. Yeah. Yeah.
So was it just that like what was kind of that makeup of that initial site early on? It was just the one reporter and then the business people?
Well, it was that, but there was some other functions of the site. So in those days, I wasn't really involved in the core business, but I was running an agency, and that agency had some staff who had, prior to coming on board with the agency, done some experimental development work with kind of a community portal, and then a flash-based mapping system. So they'd actually hand traced every single street in Sault Ste. Marie, and they were selling business listings on it. This is long before the days of kind of the public Google Maps, etc. And so we brought all those things together along with the classifieds engine, and then started publishing obituaries. So there was kind of this mix of not just original reporting, but really all the things that a daily newspaper in healthy times would have provided. And so that was kind of all brought together into this world that was then called Sioux Today.
But it wasn't really that profitable, right? That first site, at least at first.
No, I think it took many years to build an audience, but I would say that certainly the bleeding slowed down. Maybe that's the best way to say it, as compared to the coupon site. And so they brought salespeople in and started generating some more revenue. And so that was kind of able to sustain and slowly grow that business over the first while. But no, it was never really a profitable business on its own.
And so you were working at this agency. What made you decide to join the company? Or I think you became a majority stakeholder. What made you decide to make that move? Was this before it had expanded into other sites? And what was your initial thinking about it?
There was an early day expansion a couple of years into the Sioux Today conversion, with a sister site in North Bay, but that, fast forward eight years or so, and that was just a single person operation. The Sioux site had built up a tremendously sized audience. And so what happened was I was running the agency in parallel. Our agency took a minority shareholder interest in the original Sioux Today company because we did a lot of the early development work kind of in lieu of cash. So we had an in-kind kind of investment. And about, well, I guess it's 6.5 years ago or so now, I sold the agency and had intended to just go into digital consulting. So I'd started a small digital consulting company, of which Sioux Today was a client of mine. And at the time, I had kind of just finished managing 30 staff in a mid-sized agency with a couple different locations. And I was kind of committed to just taking it easy, working a few days a week, working on some specialized clients with specialized skills. And, as I got to a bit deeper into the Sioux Today business model and some of the ad operations side and analytics and even the sales side of things, it was really exciting to me. And so I, probably about 6 months in, made an approach to the current shareholders and said that I had an interest in running the company and taking over a majority interest, and made them an offer at fair value to do that, and took over at the time. And so that was kind of step one. We then went to the sister site in North Bay, which had a slightly some common but some other shareholders. So we bought them out and brought the two together. We then bought out a local competitor in Sault Ste. Marie, which was a site running primarily kind of video focused, but they did some other things that overlapped. So we bought them, and then we stepped back and said, okay, what is this thing called? And I think a few months in, our creative director came up with the name Village Media, and we loved it. And that was it. Away we went.
And how long ago was that where you guys were making these initial moves?
That was about 5.5 years ago, like 5.5, 6 years ago.
And so, but you eventually decided to start expanding to other towns and cities. Was that kind of the initial view? Was that you could scale this to more and more sites, or was that something you guys
Yeah.
eventually?
Yeah, that was my kind of whole interest. I knew that I wouldn't probably don't like to rest too much, so I knew that if I was going to take over the Sioux site, that we would certainly want to grow it. And in those days, I thought the goal would be to grow it into kind of the largest media network in Northern Ontario, which is pretty much just five main communities all around, anywhere from kind of 40,000 people to about 120,000 people. And so that in the day was the interest, was to take this, build some technology that would let us scale more efficiently and more effectively, and kind of dominate Northern Ontario. And obviously, fast forward to today, and it's gone a lot further than that, but that was the original interest.
And so, walk me through this expansion. How do you decide to move to a new area and launch a new site?
In the early days, because we weren't quite ready to do it yet, but we wanted reach so that we could start selling the audience. We actually partnered with some traditional media outlets, two community newspaper companies in Sudbury and Thunder Bay, Ontario. And we went to them and said, "Look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build some technology to run this business efficiently. We'll help you with kind of guidance and transformation to digital." And selling, et cetera. And so we onboarded those partners right away, mostly because we didn't have, we weren't ready. We didn't have the technology built. We didn't really fully understand the business, and we didn't have a ton of capital to work with to just kind of start launching new sites from the get go. So we partnered in those two. We kind of came across by chance a site in Timmins, Ontario, which was one of those five northern communities, where there was it was almost like a hobbyist site. Someone was running it full time, but it was something they wanted to get out of, and it had the same name. It was Timmins Today. So we acquired that, but really didn't pay much attention to it. So it wasn't really until about kind of 3 years after we started, at which point we had completed the build of the platform, the community engine, as we call it today, that we really said, okay, we've got a better handle on the business. We're now in full control of our own technology. The Sioux site's become successful and profitable. We've turned the North Bay site around. We've got these partnerships, and let's get going. And and away we went.
And so, like these days, now that you're a little bit more well capitalized and have a steady revenue base, like what's your decision making process for launching new sites?
So for us, there's certain community criteria that we look at. One of them is size. So we've kind of purposely stayed away from major markets, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it's competition, but a lot of it's just kind of the nature of the community and how it feels about itself. So we kind of say one criteria is it's not a commuter community. So this concept of I live here and I work here works for us, and even better, I was born here. And so you get this really strong sense of community identity, almost a sense of isolation from other major media markets. And so that then you kind of get to know that the audience is looking for certain things, certain kind of news coverage, certain types of community information, in some cases even classified ads or real estate or automotive listings, things like that. So that's definitely a major set of criteria for us. After that, we look at kind of contiguous markets. So if we can open a market that's nearby another, it often helps from every aspect of the business, whether it's travel to sharing of content across regional clusters to selling clients across regions. And then, of course, we look at competition. Although in a lot of cases, it's less relevant than you might think. It's certainly not the first criteria when we enter a market. Many people would think that we would only go into a market that was kind of a news desert, as you would call it today, and when in fact almost every one of our markets has healthy. Well, I shouldn't say healthy.
Mhm.
It has a lot of media competition. Every one of them pretty much has a daily newspaper, if not a daily and a weekly, and then radio and TV and whatnot. So it's certainly a consideration. In some markets, it has led to the acceleration of launch. Barrie and Orillia, or sorry, Guelph and Orillia, are the best examples of that, which actually then benefited our Barrie site when dailies closed. But it's not necessarily the number one criteria.
And what's the like minimum size of a area that like I was interviewing another person who runs a network of local news sites, and his rule of thumb is that an area needs at least 10,000 residents
Yeah,
before it could sustain an actual news organization.
I think that that's our smallest now. So we operate in Elliott Lake, which is about 10,000 people. And it would be our leanest operation in the sense that it has, it doesn't have a full-time salesperson in an office, for example. I think some of the new product, the new programs we're rolling out might enable us to push a bit lower than that even. But today that's kind of the lower limit. Most of our markets are, kind of 30,000 up to about 150,000 on our owned and operated side.
And what's kind of the minimum staffing for an individual site?
Outside of that 10,000 person market, I would say, we try to look to have in that the 30,000 plus a community editor who would also have a reporting function, a full time reporter, and a full time salesperson. So you would ideally launch a smaller market with 3 full-time people, and then of course add as you go along, and of course complement with freelancers as well.
What's the community editor aspect of the job?
So they're really kind of set tone for editorial. So they would, that we give them a lot of autonomy in terms of how they operate. They're guided by a managing editor and a team here in the Sioux office. We also have a support desk team here that does a lot of things like posting obituaries and moderating comments, moderating user accounts, etc. So the editor, the community editor, is really responsible for kind of setting the tone of coverage in the community and the depth of it. They would oversee the reporters, and they would obviously also then oversee and assign freelancers as well.
Oh, so they're kind of like an editor for the site. I assumed community meant like they were managing comments or user generated content
Oh,
or
I'm
anything.
sorry. No, no. So it's like
Uh,
a city editor. Yes.
mhm,
Sorry.
mhm.
Apologize. Yeah.
And you mentioned this custom platform. So there's always this debate with media companies: should we be using some kind of open source or already existing content management system, or should we build our own? Can you talk a little bit about what it took to build and maintain that platform, and why you chose to do the custom route rather than using WordPress or something else like that?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I think a lot of that goes towards my background. So the agency that I founded and ran for many years was started as a web development agency. It kind of morphed into a more comprehensive Marcom agency, but our specialty was always digital, and in particular, some custom web application development. And so along the ways, of course, we used the WordPress and all the other kind of off-the-shelf content management systems when clients demanded it. But I always learned that if you really wanted to achieve kind of exactly the specification you wanted with the most flexibility, then we were builders. We love to build from scratch. And because we'd been watching and building for this business as the agency for 10 years, we kind of knew that an off-the-shelf solution would never afford the feature set and the efficiency that something we could build would do. And so it was always a given. And to be honest with you, it wasn't even an evaluation to me. I knew that when we started that we would, in time, set out to do this. And, looking back, I would 100% make that decision again, but I would do that because of the background. That I had, that the core developer of our platform who is actually my brother, who worked with me at the agency for the 10 years prior. We were able to do it quite efficiently, where that might otherwise take years of development. Although, to be fair, we're still developing. We're always adding almost weekly new features to the platform, but there's no question we would do it again.
And how has that shaped your strategy? Like I interviewed, another company I talked to, they were able to build like custom ad products, ways to people for community members to submit press releases, classifieds. Like what have you been able to build that you wouldn't get or would be harder to do from using third party
Well,
platforms?
Well, that's just it. I mean, so we built way more than just a CMS. We built a classified engine, an auction engine, a user account kind of profile management system, our own comments and comment moderation platform. We've got mapping, custom analytics built in, voluntary pay modules built in, real estate, automotive hooks. It goes on and on. So what's happened is we've built not only this platform that's integrated, meaning we're not bolting on and cobbling together this Frankenstein of a whole bunch of tech, but our licensing costs are effectively zero because we built it all. But the user experience side of it and the integration of user data side is 100% ours. So we're not shipping data all over the place. We're not, we're able to take full advantage of, hey, you've got one account on our platform and you can now do all of these things. And by the way, we can really, really effectively manage it with a smaller team because it's tuned for that. And, it would take so long to build something to that particular specification. I mean, that's what the whole platform is built for. It's not built to do, run other types of sites. It's built to be a multi-site publishing engine or a community engine, as we call it, because of all those other features attached to it.
You mentioned comment moderation. Like, what are you doing in terms of trying to get the communities more engaged? Like, do your sites have comment sections or other ways that users can
Oh yeah.
write content? Can you talk a little bit
Yes,
about that?
absolutely. It's a great question, and we talk about it all the time. So we used to use Facebook comments, and as we grew, we realized that it was really difficult to moderate. There wasn't kind of a central moderation capability. Plus, we knew we wanted to do more with it. So we built our own commenting system and integrated into the kind of the back end admin modules of the environment. So now all of a sudden user accounts were connected to their comments, etc. But then we bolted in some, so we use Google's Perspective API for toxicity monitoring. We use some Microsoft engines as well to to kind of pre-moderate blacklisted words, etc. And so we said, before we kind of start to build up our community discussion, we need to make sure we put great infrastructure in place. Now that's in place, we're slowly kind of picking away at, well, how do we, for example, ask questions? How do we start in getting the community engaged in better dialogue? And so, can we make this a safer environment for them? And I would definitely say it's not 100% safe. Of course, you still suffer from the issues that everyone does that runs comments, but the more and more safe we can get for users and the more that they come to participate, then we could do things like asking questions at the end of an article to say, how do you feel about this? Or, how did you react to this article, et cetera. And so we're trying to kind of build a more healthy debate with the community. At the same time, we've launched features like in-story polls. So if you're not comfortable commenting and don't want to see your account or your username up there, you can vote on a poll. And we also launched a mood meter. So if you kind of have a particular type of reaction to a story, then you can express that by clicking on a mood icon, almost like an emoji at the bottom of the story. So we try to always look at ways that we can engage with the audience back and forth.
And do you did those comments ever make it into stories or spur like new story ideas or something? I've been really interested in the value of, because like a lot of news organizations abandoned their comments sections, and I recently wrote an article about how that was kind of dumb because they should have really focused on really cultivating that. So like, how much like actual additional value do they drive to the reporting process?
I honestly, I would say today, I don't think a lot. I think some, no question, some. But I think these are things we're working on more and more. I don't think you'll see us give up on comments. You'll see us continue to escalate our efforts into exactly that. How do we have better discussions two ways with our audience, and how do we get them more engaged? We're actually piloting a project with Google in Canada called Bulletin, which is getting the user engaged and contributing content. So we're always looking at how to do that. I don't think that I would say that we've got it perfected by any means at this point in time.
So tell me about like the benefits of a network in terms of pooling resources and cross-pollination. First off, like what are you doing at the headquarters to provide support to individual sites? Like, are you providing editorial and marketing guidance? Like how does that play into it?
Yeah, so head office, we have finance and operations. We have a creative team here that does all the ad design work for the network, so we don't outsource any of that. We have kind of creative direction for the village media as well as the community brand. So, you need a tent or a coffee mug design, that all happens here. Obviously, technology is 100% centralized. And that the tech itself is what we would call opinionated, meaning it functions a pre-described way based on how we think is most effective to operate the business. So, for example, a local team doesn't have to worry about publishing to social. The platform handles that. They don't have to worry about kind of hand curating a daily email. The platform does that for them, so they don't worry about that. We also, as I mentioned earlier, have content administrators who do things like moderate accounts, moderate comments, fix typos, post obituaries, all of those kinds of things. And then in terms of marketing the sites, we also centralize most of that function, although some tends to fall more at the community integration level on the local sales team. But things like running social campaigns or search campaigns in particular when we're launching a new market are all centralized here at head office. So when you look at the makeup of the local market, it really is truly first and foremost a local reporting team, and then followed with a sales team. But it doesn't require all of the other complexities of running a local media operation.
What are the local building blocks for reporting? Like I got my start in local newspapers, and both the two ones I worked for, both of them really highly prioritized covering the local schools. Like that was the most important thing. Next was probably local government, and then local businesses after that. But then the one I worked for, they really prioritized local school sports. They even had a reporter who was dedicated solely to that. Whereas the second one I worked for barely covered local school sports at all. It was not a huge priority. It was an afterthought. In terms of the eclectic mix of like when you're building a team, where are you putting most of the emphasis?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Things I think have changed a little bit, but then they're still the same. So, local city council, for example, is kind of a given in any one of the sites that you go to as priority. Coverage of schools or hospitals or things like that would kind of probably fall after that. The general day to day goings on of the community. So police news, whether it would be accidents or other police news. If you think about weather or transportation or closures, that would form a significant chunk of content in all of the communities that we cover. I think event coverage, nonprofits, charities, new business openings are all part of it. And then there's a lot of kind of human interest, kind of feature based, here's a community member that's just done A, B, or C, or won an award, or whatever it may be. I think that's the mix. You'll see some amount of court coverage that tends to be more in depth depending on the size of our market. The
Yeah,
only
that was
area that I
something that
would
was never
say,
prioritized at the two newspapers I worked for. Is like we would do a little bit of courts coverage if there was something big, but we didn't have someone who was down there all the time, like covering, random court
yeah,
cases.
and
But
and we
whenever
would
I got sent,
approach it the same way.
whenever I went down there, there was always like fascinating things that were happening. So I always thought while I was down there, I was like, man, like there's probably a lot of stories we're missing just by not sitting down here, daily, just watching the every single local court case happening. I don't know. It's just something that I don't think a lot of local newspapers devote a lot of attention to.
Yeah, no, and I think that's fair. I know that we also don't have someone full time at court all the time in any of our sites. But I think you're right. There's always interesting things going on, and I think as we evolve and as the business grows and the model continues to grow, then you'll see us cover more and more things like that. The one area that we've kind of always struggled with though is sports, which is interesting, and I think that often was an anchor in daily community newspapers, and we've struggled to get traction in that area. And I think what you learn is that game coverage, in the moment game coverage in today's world, there's so many sources of that information now, social media being a big one, right? So you've got kind of every parent who 20 years ago couldn't wait to see their kid's name or photos in the paper. And now, they're posting it to Facebook or Instagram or Twitter in the moment it's happening, along with kind of their own version of game coverage. So we've kind of learned on the sports side that it tends to be more featured based, like we're doing a profile of an athlete or whatnot, versus necessarily just the particular outcome of a game itself.
Yeah, that's interesting because most of those didn't really exist when I was in newspapers. Certainly not when I was in high school. So I haven't thought about how that changes the dynamic. That like they're posting Instagram photos and videos like while the game is happening.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, and I think you've got typically a lot of other media coverage. So you might have live radio if it's a larger event, or you might have newspaper coverage, and so I think there's a whole bunch of dynamics going on, and we're just always trying to find our position in that, where we fit best.
So you mentioned the benefits of two sites being are in adjacent cities and stuff like that. So what kind of network of benefits are you seeing there, where you see where you're able to cross pollinate content and advertising and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So outside of kind of all the efficiency of the central operation that I talked about, when you look at kind of these regional clusters, what you see is absolute benefit of cross pollination in editorial. So we're very locally focused. I mean, as much as we carry national content, it's very limited from an audience standpoint with us. However, if you get communities that are 20, 30 minutes apart, there's oftentimes things that a local reporter is covering on the edge of one market that's relevant to two or more. And so there's a huge benefit of scale in that sense. And then same with advertising. You got a local client, they want to reach people 20 minutes down the road just as much as the ones right inside their community. So there's no question that there's some efficiency in those regional clusters.
Talk to me about revenue. Are these sites profitable?
They're not all profitable, but the mature ones are. Sue Today being the oldest, and then other ones that have come along the way. We've learned that it can take probably 2 years plus to get a site to profitability. Some happen a little faster because of market conditions. There's one or two where I might say it might not happen for longer than that, just based on the way the audience is responding. But certainly, we've been able to accelerate growth through the profitability of some of the core sites themselves. And I'm a big believer that this model can work. I guess we all are. I mean, we're all pretty passionate about it, and it's not easy. But I think as you see the audience and the industry transforming, you kind of see there's more and more hope every day in terms of this. So, without question, these sites can be profitable. It just takes time. If you look back at old models, you didn't walk into a market with a newspaper or a radio transmitter for zero cost. And so instead of building printing presses and building towers, transmission towers, our investment is building audience. And once the audience is there, then there's a tremendous number of ways to monetize it that can make a real business out of this.
I'm assuming a lot of your revenue is coming from advertising. Are you doing ad sales just at the local level, or do you also have an ad sales staff at the headquarters trying to get larger accounts? How does that dynamic work?
It's pretty much all local level. So any kind of national sales, we do have one rep that does kind of work with national clients, but I'll be honest, it's somewhat limited. Most of the national sales come through open auction, ad exchanges, etc. We have some outstream video product that's sold nationally for us by another company. That whole mix is under 20% of our total revenue. So the bulk of it really is the local sales teams selling local and or regional clients directly.
And are there benefits to, I mean, like the ad sales people to cross pollinate? Because like obviously you get some of those network effects, like for me to sell to an adjacent city or whatever, like just so if I have like a regional business and I'm in town A, for news site A, are there benefits to me to try to sell also advertising in news site B? Like what kind of things are you doing
Yeah, absolutely. And so just like editorial, there's a tremendous benefit to that. So we have financial institutions or school boards, for example, or regional associations that when they come to a sales rep, they're able to now sell them, multiple sites at the same time, which is great for us, but it's also great for the client. It makes it very efficient for them to buy in that sense.
And as you get more spread out across the country, are you seeing more benefit to the programmatic auction advertising at all because you're scaling your audience and covering a larger demographic of people?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we already see that to some extent. I mean, we're extremely dominant in Northern Ontario in particular, and then some other regions in the province. And so you're starting to see some interest for some auto companies, for example, where we can reach a very particular audience in a very big way. So obviously, the more we grow, we would expect that will continue to happen. But if we think about it, my goal would be to have zero national sales. It would be to fill these things with local clients because much like the newspaper in the healthy days of newspapers where the local advertisers to me form part of that envelope of content, and so local businesses like to see themselves beside local content, but local readers like to see local businesses advertising beside what they're reading, and you see that really working. So I think our focus will be to say, how do we sell 100% of our inventory out locally and never mind open auction or national advertisers? Let's drive tremendous benefit for these local advertisers and make it work.
Yeah, but at the same time, there are a ton of businesses that are local businesses, but are a part of national chains that will have locations in multiple sites or, different stuff like that, where that kind of scale can help a lot, I think.
100%. Yes, definitely
Yeah.
agree.
So tell me about your local legacy newspaper competitors. Like, how are you beating them? How are you outcompeting them? How are you, like, where are you seeing the differentiation?
I think there's a couple things. I think in almost every one of our markets, we would be larger than the legacy newspapers from a digital audience standpoint. That's pretty much almost universally the case. And so I think part of it is that obviously we're pure play digital. That's all we think and do all day long. That's the way our editorial team thinks and functions. We promote ourselves like a digital pure play, so we build audience in specific ways. So I think there's a whole kind of set of guidelines and criteria about how we operate that's probably a little bit different. The other side of it is, though, is that we, by nature of being a pure play and a distinct brand, in the eyes of our audience, we are different as well. And I think this concept of, positioning and audience perception is really critical. And I think, they look at us to be, oh, well, I'm the go-to source of news for Sault Ste. Marie. I'm going to bookmark you, make you my homepage. I'm going to come back to you 2 or 3 times a day because I know I'm going to see something new happening. I'm going to come back to you for comprehensive community coverage that hasn't been scaled back because you've got not only local news, but you've got obituaries and some classifieds and transportation and weather and all of these kinds of things. So I think that the fact that we position ourselves in the minds of the audience that way really helps. And I think you could argue on the other side that, look, hey, if tomorrow we decided to go and publish a newspaper, I don't think we'd be good at it. We're not in the business of it. And so I think this is us. This is our life. We've live and breathe this stuff every day, and this is our
It's
priority.
interesting you say that because a lot of local newspapers are failing right now. A lot of like blame is being pointed towards like Google and Facebook sucking up, a lot of that local advertising. Some of it's, towards hedge funds that are buying these newspaper chains up and sucking them dry. I get the sense that like these successful digital media companies, like a lot of them are like they're benefiting or they're beating or staying healthy because they're just much leaner operations. Like these legacy newspapers, they're trying to adapt to a digital world, but they have these very heavily staffed, high overhead. They're trying to do it with these kind of legacy systems in place, and the benefit of these digital media companies like you is you're able to grow organically in this kind of digital media environment. Do you think that's why some of these digital media companies are successful while their legacy counterparts are really struggling? Or what do you think the secret sauce is there, that why you're not being crushed by Googles and Facebooks of the world?
Yeah, well, I think that's definitely part of it too. So I think you look at that, we're leaner, we're more efficient, but then so that's part one. Part two is we behave differently, and part three is we're received differently by the audience. I think it's a mix of all of those things. Um, that make it work.
What kind of distribution platforms are you most reliant on for driving traffic? Where are you seeing a lot of your traffic coming from?
Well, it all depends on the maturity of the market. So a legacy market, like a mature market for us, I hate to use that word legacy when I talk about us. And let's say a mature market for us, like the Sioux or a North Bay, would actually drive the bulk of its traffic through direct. You mean I am bookmarked or on their homepage or on their home screen and mobile. Or organic search, which mostly is the brand name itself. So those would be the primary traffic drivers. After that, you're going to have more broad organic search terms, and of course, Facebook. Facebook is always a significant refer of traffic, although less than it was 3 years ago and less than it was 2 years ago, et cetera. If you look at a new market, we tend to use Facebook as a real core kind of part of our launch strategy, at least in the online world. And so we'll drive a higher percentage of traffic in early days. But what I love this past year is we're using all of these channels to drive people to, in some cases, email subscription. And we actually have some markets where email, total page views by email subscribers over the course of a month are beating out organic search, and they're beating out Facebook, which is amazing to see. So we're always trying to make sure that from a distribution standpoint, we're diversified with the focus of always driving people back to our environment. So you'll never see us on instant articles. You're not going to see us amp our pages. It's all about, okay, how do we use these networks to drive people back into our world? And then hopefully make them follow us on social, subscribe to us by email, and then bookmark us and make us their homepage.
My sense of like having watched this industry for a long time is that a lot of local news sites, when they first launch, they start seeing a ton of traffic from Google, and that's where a lot of the initial discovery happens, because people are Googling random business names, random like local politicians, school closures, different stuff like that, and then they start kind of trickling in and hitting the site, and then once they've hit it like 4 or 5 times, they start realizing like this is an actual news site. Then they start like there becomes more brand recognition. Do you kind of find that to be the case, that early on Google is like a huge driver of traffic to a new site?
Google and Facebook, those would be, I mean, the bulk of it. Absolutely. I mean, there's almost nothing else. Twitter in our world, Instagram, LinkedIn are almost irrelevant from an audience development standpoint in those early stages. So it really is Google and Facebook, outside of word of mouth and other offline efforts to promote ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Jeff, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find you online?
They can check us out at villagemedia.ca, and if you want to check out our oldest site, go to Soo Today, spelled SOO today.com.
Awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Okay, thanks, Simon.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.